Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. A quick reminder, you can now listen to this episode early and ad-free with our new subscription offer. Click on the link in the show notes for this episode to start your free 7-day trial. On this round, we welcome back my past master, Worshipful Brother Jason Lee, past master of St. John's Lodge here at my lodge in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the Craftsman Online Podcast, Brother Jason.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm excited, and I know I say this for every episode, but I really am because we go in so many different places, and on this one, we're going to be talking Dungeons and Dragons. And I know some of the stereotypes that come...
I'm sorry, what? My notes are completely wrong, Ben. I misunderstood the prompt.
I know that sometimes Dungeons and Dragons has a stereotype or sometimes even a stigma, and I found it interesting here at my lodge in DC to come across brothers that still play this on our adult age. I thought it was just something that we did in the 80s as kids down in our parents' base room. So let's start there. How did you first get into D&D, and what made you interested in playing?
So for me, it started around 12 or 13 years old, and a friend of mine received what I believe is colloquially called the Red Box Advanced Dungeons and Dragons starter set for Christmas. And this was, something that we both were extremely excited that he had received. And it was immediately taken away from him while his parents, who were both very, very religious, his father was a deacon at our church and his mother was a youth teacher of Sunday school at our church. While they could explore this a little bit more, he'd received it from an uncle who hadn't quite given the green light on this gift. And eventually it was brought back to us. And incidentally, in a case of the old man shakes his fist at the cloud, we didn't really understand the investment that we've been given because that red box set is now selling on eBay for like $150.
Wow.
Back when I was about 12, we started in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I then moved on to what is colloquially known as 3rd edition. I'm blessed to say that I skipped 3.5 and 4. Then I've recently been back in 5th edition, specifically during the pandemic when virtual tabletop really took off for a lot of people. And it has strangely been a lifetime of involvement for me, and on again, off again. Really a surprisingly rewarding game for me.
I'm a lot like your friend. My parents forbade us from playing Dungeons and Dragons, and basically our circle of friends, nobody really got into it either. And I guess that's one of this. I mentioned that there's somewhat of a stigma. I think the polite way to call it is moral panic that is around Dungeons and Dragons. And
well, I want to interrupt you and say that the actual historic term is called the Satanic Panic.
Jeez. Well, that's what it was. My parents thought that possession would take place or that there's some form of devil worshiping. And I was like, out of a board game?
It was a gateway drug to satanic worship and sacrifice and all of the things. So rock and roll, Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm sure to some people, Freemasonry, all share that same connection of the evil triad of lizard people who are coming to steal our children.
And once you meet the people that are involved with these things, you're like, they're just as normal as everybody else. They're not.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's just
astonishingly enough, when we did finally receive the box set back, the comment that my friend's mother had was that really the only evil thing that she could find was that you roll 3 6-sided dice in order to create your character. So 666 was the only connection she could find. Which tells me that she didn't really do a very deep search because there's actually a lot of...
Aren't there like spells and stuff that you can do that
archaic
go into that world?
No, there's nothing that's written into that, but it draws from so wide a range of archaic and arcane storylines that it sort of accidentally hoovers up things in the background.
Well, and to me, people are probably wondering, how does this even begin to connect with Freemasonry? But here's where it starts, is that...
Right. It doesn't. So throw to mid-reel.
Well, there aren't direct connections to the ritual, but I think when you talk about the person that's into Dungeons and Dragon, when you start to describe them and what their makeup is, you also are beginning to describe a man who would be interested in Freemasonry, which is an open thinker, somebody who's interested in exploring new ideas or new possibilities, that doesn't mind being a part of a group that seems like it's a cult or it's off the beaten path, that they're an independent person, they're an individual that's seeking others just like them, and doesn't mind getting into traditional ways of meeting. What really fascinates me with this is that it's a board game from my childhood that I never really ever got to play with, but people are still playing this the same way. I'm sure there's digital or computer versions of it, but to see guys still get together and roll the dice and do this, to me, I would love to just watch this as somebody in an audience. I think it would be extremely entertaining.
Because of the widespread availability of YouTube, that is literally a thing that you can do now. You can actually watch real play podcasts of people going through an actual adventure, either pre-written or something from the Dungeon Master's imagination, and they are telling the story in front of the podcast, and you are experiencing that. I believe Vin Diesel had a short where he was doing a couple of live action recordings of his actual games, and they were textbook random encounter charts, dice. Everything was determined on the table by how you rolled. So there's the whole gamut of that. There are a lot of similarities in what people can take out of the game. There are no parallels, accidental or intentional, which is kind of funny for how much D&D did hoover up in its creative process. They didn't accidentally pull anything in from Freemasonry that I've ever been able to find. Where the parallels are is it is an outlet for people to find an experience that they may not have ever had. So in Freemasonry, I have witnessed people who would be debilitated by anxiety and stuttering and stammering over the course of 3 years become a chaplain and start giving lodge prayer and start moving through the places and stations of the lodge. And I've seen them truly open up as transformed introverts. They didn't stop being introverts, but they could suddenly communicate because they had been brought into a community of people that created a safe space for them. We didn't care that they brought an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with letters that were kindergarten big for the prayer. We cared that they said it. And we cared that this is a person who was putting effort into changing the way that they handle things. We have had a worshipful master who, in his own words, said that he was absolutely petrified of a leadership position and ultimately became worshipful master of the lodge. And I witnessed an amazing growth of activities that we did because he had broken out of this mold of being an introvert. Examples could go on and on and on. But in the same way, I have seen people come to the table whom it was obvious that it was a deep effort for them to even walk up to me when they found out that I ran a game of Dungeons and Dragons and asked to come and participate. We had more words exchanged in the process of coordinating when they would come over to my house and play than we had exchanged in 2 years of our acquaintanceship. And sitting down at the table and being given a character, whether it was made for them or they made it for the game, and being thrown into a situation where it's not you, Michael Arce, who's speaking, it's your character. So you need to think about what would your character say in this situation. And there's a lot of tropes about, it's what my character would do that have some negative context. But for the foundation of what it does to the individual, for a lot of people, this is their first exposure to an environment where there's no consequence for what happens other than people might laugh and everybody has a good time. There's no risk of anything going wrong. And everything that does go wrong, they can blame on the dice or the character or the big bad evil guy in the game. So I've seen people just bloom in this process. And after, 6 or 7 months of playing, I've seen them really a changed person. And I know that that is part of a bigger process. It wasn't, they sat down at my table and I made them a better person. It was an element in this process of their exploration of how they could change things in their life. This was someone who had taken all of their efforts to just get out of the house and start going to a running club where I met them, and then got up the courage to ask to come over to effectively a stranger's house and play a board game that they'd never played before. So it was a step in the evolution. I like to say that when friends and acquaintances find out that I'm involved, the speed with which the question, how can I join, is asked is staggering. This statement is equally accurate from my experience as a Mason and as a DM. I actually am a lot more open about the fact that I'm a Mason than I am as a dungeon master, because as soon as you say that you run a D&D game, like, oh, we should get a game together. When can I come over?
Right. Well, that's the funny. You as soon as you say you're a Freemason, you either get peppered with 1,000 questions, or it just soars and nobody responds at all, and there's no attention made. But I think if you said, "Oh, I'm still into Dungeons and Dragons. I'm a dungeon master," people would be like, "How old are you? Like, who do you hang out with and do this?
You must be running it for your kids, right?" Like, no.
And I'm also thinking, as someone that was into D&D, to hear the words ancient mysteries, chamber of reflection, inner sanctum sanctorum, heramic legend, the things that are associated with Masonry, those buzzwords. When you were going through your initiatic experience, was like 12-year-old Jason that was just discovering that Red Box series of D&D, did he have a part that night? Was he in your mind there? In
a strange way, yes. So I had been originally drawn to Masonry because of the History Channel special on Masonry. For better or for worse, it brought a lot of people in. I went through a long ordeal of asking several people before I found the lodge that I eventually entered. And that first night, I remember sort of chuckling at, so this has a little bit more live action cosplay in it than I expected.
Right.
And even as a tabletop gamer, you have hierarchies of what, to break it down into the classic high school stereotypes. The jocks look down at the nerds, and the nerds look down at the tabletop gamers. And the tabletop gamers definitely kind of look down on the live action role players and the LARPers. And the divide between, you're making a little bit too much of a serious endeavor out of something that's clearly supposed to be a game. How do you eat Cheetos when you have vampire fingers on? That kind of thing. So I sort of chuckled to myself as I was donning the costume and trying desperately to listen to the lecture as I was just generally hoodwinked about the experience, and trying to understand what was being said to me. And in the darkness, just having these images flash through my mind that really sort of paralleled the creative imagery that comes from tabletop gaming. We did not have expensive props. We rarely even had any type of a map that was laid out. We usually just had grid squares that were big enough for markers that we used to move pieces around. The dragon from one quest often became a cobalt in the next one, and it was shaped like a G.I. Joe figurine the whole time. So we used a lot of creativity there to look at the space we were in and see more of it. So in that respect, yes, there was a little bit of my childhood that came rushing back in creativity as I went through that process.
I imagine we've spent a lot of time, I feel, this season talking about the Hiramic legend, but just that experience, again, with being hoodwinked for a majority of it and really basically hearing the play that's going around and this murder and this mystery and all of these things. And, and I can only imagine how much more vivid your experience was in your imagination than mine, which was like, is this like an episode of CSI? It's like, I don't know what's going on right now.
Like, when did I end up in Babylon? What? Yeah. And to that respect, I feel like Brother John Nagy probably has an answer to this question. I've always kind of been curious about, is there like a fourth or a fifth person perspective on the ritual that we go through that looks at things from a different angle? The story that we experience in the first person as the candidate, and the story that we experience in the third person in the audience, and then the story that we experience as the cast members, all of those are telling the exact same story. And I've always been curious, what would the guard who turns the fellow crafts away, what would his experience have been in that storytelling, other than the moment that we touched them?
So one of the things that we had talked about was the recent Dungeons and Dragon movie that came out. And what I like about it as a non-D&D tabletop gamer is that I found it extremely entertaining. It really shed a light onto the story and kind of the fantasy of Dungeons and Dragons, and did give, some clues, a little learning on some of the terms and what it means. And my thought was that a typical experience that you would have, or was that like a story that you could purchase? So my question, Jason, is what would have been one of your favorite D&D adventures, and why are you still so attached to it?
You can, in fact, purchase adventures pre-written. You can run a game that is entirely born out of the imagination of the DM. You can run something that's in the middle. That's really one of the things that drew me to D&D, is that it is all things that you want to try are possible. And the DM is really just there as the arbiter of chance and understanding what is going to succeed and fail. And if you do succeed, what is the event of that? And if you fail, what are the consequences? For me, the most memorable experiences were when a story was coming together in such a way that I knew elements about the environment that, for obvious reasons, I wasn't giving away. And my party was desperately trying to figure out a solution. And I can't tell you what campaign it's in. I can't tell you if it's pre-written. It must have been, because of the nature of it. I can't tell you what they were doing before, and I can't tell you what happened afterwards. I could tell you everybody who was sitting around that table, and I could tell you every character that they had, and that through a series of events, they had awoken an army of the undead. Ghosts, skeletons, zombies were all shambling after them, and the party ran up a spiral column, stairs on the outside of the columns as opposed to on the inside. And they're running and fighting retreat, and they get to the top of this column, and they realize that it is just 50 feet off the ground, flat column. They've just run to the top of it. And in any direction they look, they can see an archway that leads to some sort of a doorway, but there's 120 feet or more of open space between them, as if a floor had been completely eliminated. And I remember that I had put in some sort of a mechanism that in real time, they had to figure out what was going on. So in game time, they probably had less than a minute and 20 seconds. And I told them, okay, we're going to give you a 12-minute window to deconflict what's happening here. So they start tossing things back and forth and discussing how they're going to do things. And everybody has different opinions on what they should do. And I happen to know, because I had the module in front of me, that certain archways had an invisible bridge that led towards them. And that there were, on some of them, a straight shot directly to the archway. On others, there was a turn or a missing section. And I remember reading through this and seeing them struggling and thinking to myself, this feels like it's ripped off straight out of a movie. What movie was that? Oh, wait, that was Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones
in The Last Crusade.
So now,
like, when you describe that, I'm like, that's the scene where he has to throw the pebbles. Yeah, okay.
And I am sitting there. The party is still. They're descending into chaos. It is turning into, Lord of the Flies. I have the conch. You have to listen to my plan, because I have given them this time frame that they are rapidly losing time on. They've wasted it for going out and getting drinks, and somebody took a bathroom break, and they spent 4 minutes berating a character because of the type of character that he'd written up. So they don't realize this is coming apart. And I'm just looking at the clock and I'm thinking, how does that theme song go? And without even realizing I was doing it, I start humming. Dun, 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 and I have probably gotten 3 bars into it. And my friend immediately to my right, his head snaps at me and his eyes open up wide. And he's like, "Are you shitting me?" And he grabs a bag of copper coins and helicopters them over his head. As the coins go flying everywhere, I'm like, oh man, I gave this one away. And we roll to figure out how the coins are going to react. And they fall on the invisible walkways, and he chooses one, and he proceeds to keep tearing bags of coins off of the cleric that they have in the party, and using these coins to lead their path to the escape. And I just remember very clearly the surprise in myself that, 3 lines from a song had given the whole shtick away. My friend's reaction to the realization of what was going on, and just the whole experience around it. I can still see every element as though I was captured there. To draw this all back to Masonic experience, I can tell you absolutely everything down to a fraction of an inch that was on that trestle when I was first brought to light. I remember that experience so vividly to this day. I can even still smell the bizarre air conditioning humidity that the room provided in the darkness with a single column of light coming down upon me. There's so much about it that is vivid, that those 2 memories clearly share the same sort of crystallized moment in my mind of what that experience was. So
you had me at Indiana Jones.
Yes.
Well, we've mentioned this several times on the podcast, and the aim of Freemasonry is making good men better. So I wanted to close out our time together with this last question on D&D, and how has it impacted your life outside of the game, or like Freemasonry? Were there any skills or lessons that, continue to be a part of your everyday life?
D&D was a very helpful part of my pandemic survival plan. I got involved with several different virtual groups. I actually purchased a virtual tabletop role-playing game environment and ran games for my friends who were living in Colorado, myself in Washington, D.C. at the time, but unable to actually visit my friends who were just down the road. So we were able to get into, we were using Discord and run this game pretty smoothly in a virtual environment. I also got involved through another friend. He brought me into a separate group where I was a player, and I got to really, in that 18 months that I was involved with that group, I got to play more as a player character than I had probably in 30 years previously, just because someone else was the DM and he took a lot of enjoyment in that. And I have friends from that I've never met in person, but I know them well enough now from having spent so much time virtually with them, and just discussing with them in the downtime and hanging out virtually, that I would have zero issue inviting them over to my house, and have gone out of my way to visit some of them when they have visited. post-pandemic. So in the same way that Masonry has expanded my circle of friends and acquaintances, very recently, I actually just met here in Germany a German police chief who was wearing a Masonic ring, and I ambushed him in the hallway and shoved my mitt into his, and all of a sudden we were immediately having a conversation about Masonry just because of our handshake. So the connection that can be there because of the shared language and the shared experiences, extremely valuable. As far as ways of moving forward, for me, I am an extrovert. I've never met a microphone I was afraid of, and I've never found a silence I wasn't prepared to fill. So, the lessons for me have really been in watching other people expand, and how to help and how to foster them and how to create that safe space. And right now in the new normal that we have, and the reality that we're looking at, as we're recording this, there's turmoil in Russia. Everything is still going on in Ukraine. I'm living in Germany. My friends are all in the United States. We have so much going on around us that it doesn't hurt for us to try to intentionally make safe spaces for ourselves and for our friends. And there is zero shame in any of that anyone should feel. And anyone who tries to villainize that effort is really missing out. They're missing out on an opportunity for themselves and for those around them, because really it is just invaluable to have that. I remember when I first became a Mason, one of the things that an old Masonic friend of mine had mentioned is that the real value that he took from Masonry was it was an environment for men to be with men. And that he felt that in his life, he had at the time 3 daughters. He was surrounded by women in his life because of work. He was a medical doctor. He had 6 nurses underneath him, all of whom were female. And he said that really, if he didn't have Masonry, he felt very isolated in gender. And his was an extreme representation of that. But that was for him, what Masonry created was that safe space for him to be with other men and to have those shared experiences that really men have.
When you talk about safe space, I have to keep the laugh in because we use the Discord server, one of our brothers for Lodge, for us to have meetings at the pillar officer level. And I noticed one time that there was the D&D Discord room channel, whatever. I'm not really a gamer, so I don't know. And I went in there, and I had avoided going in there because I thought D&D meant do not disturb. So when I went in there, that's when one of the brothers was like, "Hey, are you into D&D?" And I'm like,
well, I took a wrong turn.
I don't know how to answer this question. Are you talking about
Yeah. Is this a challenge? Abort.
You guys, we're in our 40s. We still play this? Like, wow.
I think that one of the things that my father in particular has had a lot of difficulty understanding as he has aged and witnessed the world around him, and now being in my 40s and having children, the changing expectation of things. We don't stop enjoying something just because we're older. The nature of which we enjoy it changes. I read very, very little when I was a teenager because I had a learning disability, and it took me a long time to understand why once I read something, I had it memorized, but it was really hard for me to read. And once I learned those skills, I stopped reading the books that helped me learn to read properly that might as well be, psychological study guides, and started reading the books that I enjoy. I still read. It didn't stop reading because I got older, but I also still play video games. I still watch television. I still play Dungeons and Dragons. I just curate it in a different way. And it is a much more mature way than it was when I was a child. And for my father, he has recognized that he needs to grab onto some of those things that he had let go, because he had been trained as the child of a greatest silent generation, that, you are an adult now, you leave all those childish things behind you, and you go to work, you make your money, you support your family. And now he and my mother are retired, and they're like, well, shit, what do we do with all this free time?
Hey, Dad, you want to roll the 6-sided dice? Well, this is my least favorite part of the podcast, because I honestly feel like I could talk with you forever, and you always have been one of the most engaging and fun brothers. But I do want to let you go, because I know we have that time difference and some of us have to get up tomorrow.
Yeah, you want to roll for it? Yeah.
If you've enjoyed this episode, you can hear more by telling Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. And you can also listen to future episodes early and ad-free with our subscriber offer. Get the link in the show notes to start your 7-day free trial. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.